The West is called the West because it is west of the East. It is west of the Aegean. It is Western because it is not Eastern. The title is born out of a spatial relation. We have adopted the vantage point of looking at all of human enterprise from a God's eye view, and we have named ourselves after an accident of geography. Describing the West as Western is part of the nomenclature of Western thought, the ways in which Western thought posits a perspective on itself from outside of itself. What is titled Western is abstracted by its geographic circumstance. This abstraction is a result of an alienated point of view on the world and humanity as a whole, and ultimately it is the concept of alienation that best defines the ensemble of qualities that make up the West, while at the same time it is alienation that makes it so difficult to define the West. Alienation as a concept is introduced to us in modern times with Feuerbach, Hegel, Durkheim, Marx, but the condition of being alienated, the condition of being estranged from society, in one sense or another, predates its introduction in the world of ideas. These modern thinkers begin the discussion of it, the awareness of it as a condition of life, of modern life, and this condition is the absence of conventional religious or aristocratic authority. Alienation in the Western context is the negation of Christendom and the emergence of the modern world. Now, the two clearest examples of alienation come with the free market and scientific enterprise. These enterprises, along with constitutional government, make up the bedrock of Western civilization, and we trace this back to the ancient Greek city-states. Science attempts to explain the world with an indifference to the myths, beliefs, and hopes of a culture. It attempts to universalize its findings to show how its truth claims hold their veracity anywhere, by anyone, through repeatable experiments. The philosopher of mind Thomas Nagel describes the perspective of science as the view from nowhere. In this way, it is alienated from the prejudice of a cultural bias. We have the freedom of inquiry that allows us to discover something about ourselves that we may not like. This is what made Socrates dangerous to the state. The honest answers to our questions may be in conflict with ideas and customs that are already established. In order to consider the possibility that an established belief or myth could be incorrect requires that we separate our feelings, our biases, from the interpretation of the answer, or our pursuit of the answer. The market is also an example of alienation in that its accounting of exchange value and use value, in principle, has no regard for the special relations between families and class. What matters is the quantifiability of money and how much you have of it. Money is an abstraction of value. When we use it in the market, we step onto a universalized plane of interaction. We become reduced to it. Who we are in our interpersonal lives does not matter. We are alienated from our interpersonal lives when we use money, just as we are alienated from our interpersonal lives when we engage in science. Scientific answers are formulated with no regard for your subjectivity, or your religion, or the way you think things ought to be. If I say that the West is not the East, then I am isolating the West so that it could be understood in relation to the East. This all made more sense before the West had access to Eastern culture. Before the 19th century, very few people in Europe or America even knew of Confucius, for example. And it follows that this fact is important because the projects of European civilization did not consistently benefit from Eastern thought until modern times. So the distinction between West and the East made more sense. It had a concrete reality in the geographic and cultural boundaries that separated the West from the East. Now, if you were to stack up the characteristics, beliefs, and customs of the East and those of the West, comparing Hinduism with Christianity, Confucius to Aristotle, you would begin to build a notion for each, but when you isolate any one of these characteristics, you will find that they are closer to the universal cross-cultural characteristics that are intrinsic to all of humanity. If you look closely at any religion, you will find the human condition within it. You find the same human proclivities in any religion, or civilization for that matter. Take a step back and look at the pottery of the Anasazi and compare it to the geometric age of ancient Greek civilization, or compare Taoism to Stoicism, and you may find that they have enough in common for us to let go of the cultural distinctions between the East and the West. If I were to say that the essential feature of the West is its market-based economic system, well, one might ask, what about ancient Mesopotamia? What about the Persian Bazaar? You could isolate any one characteristic and provide a non-Western example to compare it to. And so the notion of Western culture falls apart if you look at any one aspect of it too closely. We don't have the convenience of pointing to a religion and claiming it to be the collective project that we organize our society around. We no longer refer to European civilization as Christendom. If we lived in a society of one dominant religion, we would have no problem defining ourselves. We would have no problem defining a common purpose. The modern notion of the West gradually supplanted its Christian identity through the intellectual and cultural developments of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment reestablishes a universal conception of the human being. And as we look through this universal conception of ourselves, we see past our ideology, our national identity, our religious identity. We become alienated from these features of ourselves as we recognize humanity as a whole. We go back to Protagoras, man as the measure of all things. As modern people, we have benefited immensely from this. We aim at understanding the world around us objectively, and by doing so, we reveal ourselves as alienated. We reveal ourselves as Homo sapiens, as animals, organisms. As human beings, we are studied by anthropologists. Our history is uncovered by historians and archaeologists. Our bodies are studied by biologists and physiologists. Even our interpersonal lives are studied by psychologists. And yet each of us has a first-person perspective on all of these features of humanity and life, and yet cannot understand them without first exiting our first-person point of view into the alienated realm of universality and the pursuit of objective truth. These perspectives on ourselves are separated from us. Since we are no longer tethered to divine conception of ourselves, since we are no longer tethered to a cultural orthodoxy, we can examine our being in a way that trespasses over societal constructs. This is what I mean when I use the word alienation. This is why I find it to be the essential concept of the Western identity. Notice how when we see a psychologist or a psychoanalyst, we have a doctor-patient relationship with clearly defined boundaries. The psychologist is not typically or necessarily integrated into our community. The psychologist supplants the clergyman in the absence of religious conception of the human soul. We see also in old European cities the separation of the old city from the new city, the way Paris separates its commercial skyscrapers from the heritage of its pre-modern city and architecture. Moscow does this as well, as do many European cities. This is a physical manifestation of alienation. We literally see the separation. Alienation comes with the same circumstances that bring us our freedom. For example, our freedom from religion can also be seen as an estrangement from religion. In other words, there are pros and cons to these developments. The idea of universal rights is an example of how beneficial these alienated perspectives are. They may come together in the Enlightenment era, but we see their beginnings with the ancient Greek city-states with Protagoras, man as the measure of all things. This realization requires that we reduce ourselves to our common denomination as human beings. We are no longer just members of our national identity or our religious identity, which in turn implies that we are no greater than other human beings of different origins. It means that we are all ultimately the same. What sounds at first to be completely inclusive is actually exclusive, in that Western society is predicated on the rights of the citizen, and the citizen transcends all other identities. So it depends on a mutual recognition and enforcement of constitutional rights. The universalist conception of the human being that we have inherited from the Enlightenment instills in us an inclination to see what is universal to a particular culture. It instills in us an inclination to see the common denomination to every cultural feature, however particular it may be to a specific background, religion, or nationality. For example, churches, synagogues, mosques, all become houses of worship. Their legal protection, their place in society, is generalized to their identity as places of worship. They are reduced to this title. In the United States Constitution, the different religions of the world are recognized as establishments of religion. This is an alienated, modern perspective, a Western perspective. Features of a culture that would otherwise appear particular and essential to them become manifestations of our human characteristics that are universal. So by isolating any one feature of the West, we automatically bring into relief the ways in which such features emerge from characteristics that are human and thereby cross-cultural. This is one way in which alienation makes it difficult to recognize Western identity, since it adopts a perspective on itself from outside of itself. The Westerner may even renounce his membership to the Western tradition altogether and proclaim himself to be a human being, part of the human race and no other. Another related reason why it is easy to take our civilization for granted is because all the other features of our individual identity are built on top of the foundation of Western liberalism. They grow over and cover the base level universal freedoms that allow individuality to flourish. We see past our Western identity and instead see ourselves as members of our ethnic background or our religious background or national or regional background. Whatever your background is stands over the Western identity, which is like the bedrock on which everything else we are is built on. Our personal identity takes place under the auspices of Western liberalism, where you have the freedom to experiment with your identity and with self-discovery. Another symptom of modern alienation can be seen in the way our global economy alienates the division of labor from the collective project of civilization. What do I mean? Working class people today have access to resources past generations could only dream of. Yet whatever gratitude and collective pride that could be found in such an achievement is undermined by the fact that we cannot clearly see how our labor contributes to the fabric of civilization, just as we cannot appreciate the effort that goes into the new car we bought from Korea or Japan. Our neighbors did not build the car. Our standard of living is not an achievement of a collective unifying project. Rather, it is the confluence of a plurality of different ideologies and cultures which meet on the level of the market. And as they do so, they meet as alienated modern individuals. So much of our labor is narrowed into a specialization that is far removed from the finished product. So much of the division of labor loses its dignity in the modern world. If we compare this to the collective project of building a cathedral or a temple in the heart of a city or town, we could see how the modern division of labor alienates the individual from the collective project. The project of building a cathedral brings a city together in its construction, and it holds them together as a place of worship. It centralizes the human enterprise toward a single end, the construction of the cathedral, the fulfillment of the religious life, and the settlement of a people in a place they can belong together in. When we call ourselves Westerners, we are withholding a lot of information about ourselves. We are not uniting under one language. We are not uniting under one religion or national identity. Describing European civilization as Christendom implicated the ideology of its inhabitants. It implicated their entire way of life. The metaphysical beliefs of its inhabitants was essential to what Christendom was. Westerners today are united under the idea of universal rights, under the concept of the citizen, which in turn requires a constitution to ensure those rights. Just as Rome was a multiracial society, so too is the United States and parts of Europe. The only way for this to be possible is to have a social foundation that transcends racial identity, that transcends religious identity. It requires a constitution that excludes racial essentialism. It requires a concept of the citizen, and it requires the separation of powers. These characteristics trace back to our Greco-Roman heritage, their philosophical pursuits, their property rights, and their experiments in constitutional government. They go together, and only together as an ensemble are they essential to the Western identity. So now that we have a consistent concept that unites the features of Western culture, that concept being alienation, we can now recognize its existence across the globe. We are no longer just considering an East-West geographic relation. If we apply our definition of the West to the current era, then we have to encompass not only America and Europe, but also Japan, India, Korea, Australia, New Zealand. Despite the fact that our technological, globalized culture is scattered all over the world, it is still appropriate to describe it as Western, because the institutions of Western civilization originated west of the Aegean, in the ancient Greek city-states, and also because no matter where you are in the world, you are always west of somewhere. This perspective we have on ourselves from outside of ourselves means that we are constantly on uncertain ground. What defines us as Westerners is always in question. So if you found this video insightful in any way, please press the like button and subscribe to my channel.